In the business world, it's dog eat dog, and you need every bit of competitive edge you can possibly get. Whether you're a salesperson, an entrepreneur, a small business owner, or corporate executive, you've landed on the podcast that gives you that edge and more. This is the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. Exploring the strategies, tactics, and mindset shifts needed to elevate your business and leadership skills to new heights. Your host has walked the walk. He's coached thousands of clients to remarkable results and rubbed shoulders with legends like Tony Robbins, Ken Blanchard, Jack Canfield, and Brian Tracy. It's practical advice, inspiring stories, and the occasional dose of tough love, helping you to overcome challenges and seize opportunities. This is the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. And now your host, owner of Potential in Motion, coaching you to the edge of what's possible, Tom Kelly.
Welcome to the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Kelly. Today I'd like to cover a topic that's really important for everyone. Whether you're a business owner, a corporate manager, a salesperson, or even an entrepreneur just starting a business, effective goal setting is imperative for your success. In order to have any type of success in business, or in life for that matter, you have to understand where you are and what you're trying to achieve. So in today's episode, I'm going to cover the ins and outs of goal setting. I'll talk about some key mistakes that I see people make and give you some tips on how to avoid them. I'm going to give you my 4 keys to successful goal setting, and I'll also discuss the number 1 reason why people don't achieve their goals and what to do about it. So let's jump in and get started. I'd like to start actually with a kind of a myth. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the 1953 Yale study, or some people call it the 1953 Harvard study, which tells you right away that this is maybe a little bit of a myth. But the story goes that in 1953, they surveyed the graduating class of Yale, and what they found was that the top 3% of the graduating class set goals and wrote them down and read them on a regular basis, and the other 97% didn't. And what they did is 20 years later, they came back and they studied the 1953 class, is now 1973, and what they found was that the net worth of the 3% dwarfed the net worth of the 97% combined. And this story has been going around since, at least 20 years, since I can remember when I first started in the coaching business. And I did a little research on this because I was going to use this in the podcast today. And what I found out was this is an absolute myth, that actually never happened. But having said that, in my experience, goal setting absolutely works. In fact, I'll give you an example from my personal business. When I started my business in 2002, one of the first things I did was I set a goal for myself for a year later. And my goal centered really around how many clients I had, how much revenue I was making, and a number of other things. And what was interesting is I wrote that goal down and I looked at it on a regular basis, and then I really tried to pursue that goal. And what actually happened was I achieved that goal the day before it was due. And that allowed me to continue in this business, and I've been doing this now for 22 years. But I've also found this with my clients, in that most of my clients, when they write down their goals, they actually achieve exactly what it is that they write down. Well, what's interesting too is what happens when you don't set goals. So I was doing a little research, and I found a study by Culture Partners, which is a consulting firm in California. And they did a survey of 40,000 business people, and what they found was that 85% of organizations say key results are not clearly defined, such that employees at all levels can engage. They found that 93% of survey participants indicated that the lack of clarity inhibits them from aligning their work or taking accountability for the desired results, and that 70% of survey participants indicate that the lack of clarity puts their organization's key results in jeopardy. So unfortunately, this misalignment around organizational goals creates an environment of confusion and shifting priorities, which in turn leads to low productivity and widespread disengagement. This isn't only true in corporate America, but also for individuals as well. And actually, this is an epidemic in corporate America, I believe. I work with a lot of corporate employees, a lot of corporate executives, and I find that the lack of goal setting and the lack of clarity around what outcomes are really causes massive problems, especially around engagement and around achieving results. It's also a huge problem for individuals. As an individual, if you don't have goals and you don't understand where you are today and where you want to go, then you have no way of actually achieving those outcomes, and you don't have any way to focus your time and energy. So how do we solve this problem? Well, I'm going to give you my keys to successful goal setting in a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love to engage with my audience, so if you enjoy the podcast, please head over to LinkedIn and connect with me. You can find me by going to the LinkedIn and typing Tom Kelly, MCC in the search bar. I'm looking forward to connecting with you. So what are my top 4 keys to effective goal setting? Well, number one of the things that I always tell my clients is clarity is power. And I use an example, an analogy here of this. And basically what I say is, imagine for a second that a genie popped up in your office. And the genie said, hey, your wish is my command. I'll give you one wish and you can have whatever you want. So you think for a second and you pause and you think for a few minutes and you say, hey, you know what? I would love a new car. So the genie says, great, go out in your driveway and there's your brand new car. So you're all excited. You run down the stairs, you fling open the front door, and there sitting in your driveway is a brand new 2024 Dodge minivan. Now, how do you feel about that? Well, most people, when I do this example with them, they start to laugh and they say, well, I wouldn't actually ask for a minivan. I'd ask for something like a Maserati or a Lamborghini or maybe a Porsche, right? So my point here is that often in my experience as a coach, you get what you ask for. So if you set vague goals, you're going to get vague results. And if you have very crystal clear goals, you're going to get clear results. So how do we go about, and what are some models that we can use to get some clarity? Well, probably the most successful model out there, you probably heard, is the SMART goal model. SMART goal stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. What I actually like to use, though, is a model that I learned from Ken Blanchard, and it's a little bit different than that. He changes some of the words around here. His SMART goal definition is specific, motivational, achievable, relevant, and trackable. What I find interesting about this is he changed the M from measurable to motivational. He kept the achievable and relevant, and then he changes time-bound to trackable. So why is this important? Well, when you really look at this model, the key number one is the written goal is the S and the T. So the S stands for specific and the T stands for trackable. So the goal has to be specific, and like I said, clarity is power. The more clear you are and the more specific you are, the more likely you're going to achieve that outcome. And then number 2, it's trackable. And oftentimes, and almost all of the time, in addition to being trackable, it's also time-bound. There's a deadline on that. But I think it's really important, that distinction there, that it be trackable so that you understand how to track and measure whether or not you're making progress towards that. And, one big mistake I see, especially when I'm doing work with corporate executives in that, is that they set a goal for people, not with people. This is really, really, really crucial. So just as an example, oftentimes when I'm working with salespeople, especially at the beginning of the year, I'll ask them, well, what's your sales goal? And I'll often hear, well, my goal is to grow sales by 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever that number is. And I'll ask them, I'll say, well, where did that come from? And most of the time what they'll say, well, that's what my boss told me. And of course, then I ask them, well, if your boss asked you to do that, how do you feel about that? And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, well, I'm never going to achieve that. And because they're not motivated by it, right? So it's important to make sure that when you're setting goals with your employees, that you realize that you set goals with people, not for people. And that's what's important about that SMART goal analogy there, is that the M, the motivational, is determined by the employee. So you want to make sure that when you set goals with someone, you're setting a very specific and trackable goal, but also that goal is motivational to them. And they get to determine whether they're motivated by that or not. And if they're not motivated by that, really the key there is you've got to go back and rework that goal so they are motivated. Because if they're not motivated, obviously they're just not going to achieve, or they're not going to work towards that outcome. So that's super important. The other 2 pieces here is achievable. And this is really crucial too. When you set goals with people, you both get to determine if that goal is achievable. You as the manager get to determine, or the boss, or the entrepreneur get to determine if you think that person can achieve their goal, and they also have input into that. So you want to make sure that when you set a goal, that the goal is high enough so that you start getting butterflies in your stomach, and that maybe it's feels like a little bit out of reach, but also that it's achievable. And finally, relevant. Well, who gets to determine if a goal is relevant or not? Well, that's really the manager. Because when you set a goal, if that goal is not relevant to the overall goals of the company, then that goal isn't really important, right? So number one here is clarity is power. You want to make sure that you get super clear about the goal. And when you write the goal, you want to make sure it's specific and trackable. And then the key to this is when you're setting goals for yourself, obviously you get to determine if you're motivated and if it's achievable and relevant to you. But when you set goals with other people, keep in mind that you set goals with people, not for people. That's a huge mistake I see people making. The number two thing I'd like to talk about here, my number two key to goal setting, is actually the number one reason why goals aren't achieved. And that's because they're not clear with the purpose, or you're not clear with your purpose around the goal. So the example I use for this with my clients is I ask them, I say, let me give you 30 days here. I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to give you 30 days. I'm going to challenge you to come up with $1 million in the next 30 days. How likely is that you're going to achieve that? For most people, they'll say, nah, that's not going to happen, Tom. That's a lot of money in a short period of time. So I'll change the goal a little bit, and I'll say to them, great, let's rework this goal a little bit. So I want you to imagine for a second, and I'll ask them, who's the most important person in your life? And usually they'll say their spouse or a child or someone like that. So I say, well, imagine for a second here, after work this evening, you come home, you have dinner with your family, and your wife says to you, hey, I want to talk to you after we put the kids to bed. So you put the kids to bed and your wife says, I've got some really bad news. I haven't been feeling well lately, and I didn't want to alarm anybody, so I've been going to the doctor kind of by myself, and I've been diagnosed with stage 4 terminal cancer, and the doctor says that I have about 30 days to live, and there's nothing they can do for me. And shortly after you hear this horrible news, you get a call from me. And I say, hey, I'm so sorry. I heard about your wife. I'll say some prayers for her. And, I'm really sorry that this has happened to you. But I've got some great news. I actually have access to the cure for your wife's cancer. But in order to get the cure, you're going to need to come up with $1 million in the next 30 days or your wife is going to die. Now, how likely is it that you're going to get that money? And almost always people say, well, absolutely, I'm going to figure out how to make that happen. And that's the power of purpose. And see, when most people set goals, they don't understand why they're doing them. So they don't have a clear purpose. And because they don't have a clear purpose, when it gets hard, they quit. So how do you determine what your purpose is? Well, there's really 3 key questions that you need to ask yourself. Number 1, why is this a must for me? Or why is this goal a must? And here's why that's important. In my experience, we don't do what we feel like doing or what we want to do or we wish to do or we should do. We do what we must do. So if the goal is not a must for you and you're not completely committed to it, then you're probably not going to achieve that outcome. Number 2, how am I going to benefit from achieving this? So what are all the benefits going to be when I achieve this goal? And number 3, what will it cost me if I don't achieve this goal? Now, those last 2 questions I asked for a very specific reason, because in my experience, and I've coached thousands of people here, what I find is as human beings, we do things for one of 2 reasons, either to avoid pain or to gain pleasure. So if you can use those 2 things to create leverage by associating massive pleasure to the outcome of achieving the goal and massive pain to not achieving the goal, that's going to be a huge motivator. So when you combine those 3 things, why is this a must for me? How am I going to benefit from achieving this? And what will it cost me if I don't achieve this? You usually lock in on a purpose. And when you lock in on that purpose and you're highly motivated by that, that's what's going to help you blow through and blast through those barriers and those things that are going to stop you from having results and getting the success you want. The other thing that's really important about this, if you want to leverage this even more, is extend that to other people. So not only is, how am I going to benefit from this myself, but how are other people going to benefit? How is society going to benefit? How are my customers going to benefit? How is my team going to benefit? How's my family going to benefit? When you bring in other people to that, it creates more and more purpose around that goal. Also, the same thing for what will it cost me? Think about what it will cost other people. What will it cost your family, your employees, your clients, society as a whole if you don't achieve that goal? And when you get locked in on that purpose, you're going to be super highly motivated to make that happen. Now, the other reason it's important to focus in on purpose and the why is if you can't figure out answers to those questions, then that's probably a pretty telltale sign that that goal is not a good goal for you. But if you can't figure out why you must do it and how you're going to benefit and what it's going to cost you if you don't do this is probably not a good goal, and you want to go back to the first part of this and get some clarity on what that goal is. So hopefully that makes sense. And the number three key to making sure that you achieve your goals is you've got to align your actions with your intentions. This is really important because if you don't break your goals down into actions and schedule those things and actually follow through, it's not going to happen. And it's really then at that point, it's not a goal. It's really just a dream. It's a fantasy, really. So for example, if you decide that you want to get in shape and lose 20 pounds, but you don't align your actions with your intentions by going to the gym and changing how you eat and being consistent with your workouts, you're not going to achieve that outcome. So you want to break down the goal into small action steps, and for each of those action steps, estimate how much time it's going to take, and then make sure that you schedule those things so that you actually follow through on it. And that's really key. I have a mantra that I use for myself, and I also teach my clients this, is if it's not on the calendar, it's not going to get done. So you got to break them down, you got to align your actions with your intentions, and you got to schedule it. And finally, the fourth key here is you've got to track and measure results. And I'm sure you've heard this said before, but you can't manage what you don't measure. So if you're not tracking and measuring what you're doing on a day-by-day and week-by-week basis to make sure that you're making progress towards your goal and that you're going in the right direction, you're probably not going to achieve that outcome. So those are the top 4 keys to goal setting. Number 1, clarity is power. You got to get crystal clear with what it is that you want. Number 2, you've got to understand what your purpose is. Why is this a must for me? How am I going to benefit from achieving this? What will it cost me if I don't achieve this? Number 3, you got to align your actions with your intentions, and you got to make sure you break things down and schedule them in your calendar and follow through. And then finally, number 4, you got to track and measure your results. You can't manage, again, what you don't measure. So that's super important. So what are some other keys? Those are the top 4, but what are some other keys to success? Well, one of the other keys that I find really, really important is you've got to get leverage with yourself. And there's really 2 ways I know of getting leverage. Number 1, you got to enroll other people in your success. If you set a goal, but you're the only person that knows what that goal is, then it's not really a goal because there's no one else to ask you about or hold you accountable to that. Number 2, as I mentioned before, around purpose, you want to leverage pain and pleasure. And what I mean by this is you want to associate massive pain in some way to not taking actions and massive pleasure to taking actions. So let me give you a great example of this. There was a client of mine years ago. He's a financial advisor. And one of the things that was going on when I started working with him is he wasn't making phone calls. His goal every morning was to make 35 phone calls to make appointments every day. And he just wasn't doing it. He wasn't doing it consistently. In some weeks, he wasn't doing it at all. So he said, hey, Tom, I really need to focus on this. I need to make sure that I'm taking action on this. So I asked him, I said, what are you really passionate about? And one of the things that he's super passionate about was politics. And at the time, Hillary Clinton was running for office at the time, and this guy is a right-wing Republican. Obviously most people in the financial service business are, and he just hated her. He's like, it just gets me going even thinking about her. So I said, here's what I'd like you to do. Number 1, what I'd like you to do is take out your checkbook, and I want you to write a check for, we agreed on $2,500 to Hillary Clinton's campaign fund. And I said, what you'd like to do is we're going to get really crystal clear. Your goal is from now, and it was the beginning of June when we did this, from now until the end of the year, every single workday, you're going to make 35 dials for appointments. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to enroll your manager in this. And I said, what I'd like you to do every day at 9:30 is you're going to go into your manager's office and tell him whether or not you made your calls. And if you don't make your calls, or if you don't show up at 9:30, you're going to give him that check for $2,500, and he's going to mail it into her campaign fund. And then you're going to write another check for $2,500. And you're going to keep doing this every time that you miss your target. So that was number 1. Number 2, I said, we got to figure out some way to gain pleasure here. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a big jar on your desk. And every day that you make your calls, I want you to put $10 in the jar. And at the end of the month, you can take whatever money's in that jar and spend it on whatever you want. And then the other thing we did is, in addition to those 2 things, we put a big picture of Hillary Clinton up on his wall. And then we also put a big calendar up there so every day he could track and measure whether or not he did it by checking off the day. Then the final thing we did is we enrolled all the other people in his office in his success. So what happened there is all these guys in the office started taking bets as to whether or not he was going to hit the goal. And they came in every day to check on his calendar, to ask him if he was successful, to do that. So this created massive amounts of accountability. And what ended up happening is over the next 6 months, not only did he follow through every single day, he never had to give his manager the check, but he 4x'd his business over the next 6 months. That's how powerful this is. So if you're finding yourself that you have a goal and you're just not taking action on that, not only do you want to get clear about the purpose, but you can use this leverage and leveraging pain and pleasure and enrolling others in your success to help make sure that you're accountable and make sure that you're doing those things. The other one that's a big game changer that I really like is celebration. And what I encourage my clients to do every day is at the end of the workday, find something that you can celebrate. And with respect to your goals, find something, some action that you took to that day, each day, at the end of the day, that you did to get the goal achieved or to make progress on that goal, and celebrate that action. Because what happens when we celebrate is we feel good. Imagine for a second, like when you celebrate your birthday, right? You get presents, you get cake, you feel great. And when you feel great, you want to do that again. So we want to reinforce our actions with celebration. And if we do that every day, we build massive momentum, and you'll get to your goal a lot faster if you do that. So there are my keys to effective goal setting. If you found today's episode useful, you can also access a number of free resources that will help you improve your business as well as your leadership on my website at www.businesscoachchicago.com. Also, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you, and I'd love to chat with you about anything, especially the episodes on the podcast here. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please click the subscribe button, leave a review, and of course, invite your friends to listen as well. I'm Tom Kelly, and until next time, enjoy your week.
You've been listening to the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. On this highly useful podcast for people in the business world, you get the absolute top-notch info from an absolute pro on how to elevate your business and your leadership skills. Tom Kelly owns Potential in Motion, coaching you to the edge of what's possible. He's also a professional speaker and leadership trainer. He's worked with some of the biggest names in the coaching business: Tony Robbins, Ken Blanchard, Jack Canfield, Brian Tracy. To sign up for a complimentary coaching session and to access some great free resources, hit the website at businesscoachchicago.com. Your success is not just a possibility, it's a certainty. See you next time on the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast.